The year is 1945. Japan is not just defeated in the World War II, it is completely destroyed. Two of its major industrial cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, have been obliterated by nuclear weapons, and every other major urban center was bombarded left, right, and center. 40% of all urban areas were destroyed. 2.5 million homes were burned down. Over 500 factories were reduced to ash. The country was bankrupted, traumatized, and stripped of almost every resource needed for recovery. For many nations, this level of destruction would have been the end. But what happened next shocked the entire world. Not only did Japan recover, Japan rose to become an economic superpower, and at one point in time, it was on the verge of overtaking the US in terms of GDP to become the richest country in the world. But how? Let us figure that out in this video. Japan's growth story can be divided into three parts and broadly three time frames: 1950 to 1970, the 1970s, and finally the 1980s. But before we step into Japan's growth story, there is something you need to understand about the country. Japan has a fundamental disadvantage. The country lacks mineral resources and imports most of them, especially oil. At this point in time, it didn't have much to pay for these imports, since whatever they had was pretty much destroyed during the World War. So they had to focus on building manufacturing sector, and this was also the key focus of the successive governments in Japan. Throughout the 20th century, the Japanese government realized that the nation's competitive advantage was going to come from growing industries like iron, steel, shipbuilding, marine, machine tools, and chemicals. Basically, Japan did in the mid 20th century what China went on to copy later to become the manufacturing hub. And as the saying goes, fortune favors the brave. A major event that propelled this growth for Japan was the Korean War, a war between North Korea and South Korea that started in 1950. North Korea turned to Japan for supplies. The products sourced from Japan included ammunition, uniforms, trucks, and other supplies. The effect on the Japanese economy was dramatic. Industrial output rose by 50% in just 1 year during 1950 and 1951. This kind of growth usually takes decades in other countries. Japanese firms in turn started importing more raw materials and producing and exporting final goods. By the time the war was over in 1953, Japan was back to its pre-World War II levels. However, this was just the start. From 1955 to 1972, Japan's real GDP grew at an average rate of 9.3%. During this period post the success seen because of the Korean Wars, Japan started building highways, high-speed rail networks, advanced ports, and power plants. Infrastructure that could basically rival the US. Productivity surged, costs dropped, and it started becoming the manufacturing hub of the world, just like China is today. Japanese products were everywhere. Televisions, motorcycles, radios, watches, cameras, high-quality products at affordable price points. This is when we move to the second phase of Japan's growth, the 1970s. The 1970s were a very interesting period around the world, and not in a good way. It is referred to as the Great Inflation, where countries experienced extremely high inflation. Basically, all hell broke loose in 1973 when OPEC's oil embargo came into place. When the Yom Kippur War broke out in October 1973, several Arab nations led by Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. The United States and many Western allies openly supported Israel with military supplies and logistics. In response, the Arab members of OPEC, especially Saudi Arabia, decided to punish these countries economically by cutting oil production and banning oil exports to nations that supported Israel. At the same time, these OPEC nations pushed to dramatically increase oil prices. Oil prices went up by as much as 300%. Inflation surged and many countries went into recession. Now remember how I mentioned earlier that Japan imported most of its oil? It should have suffered too, right? But despite the great inflation caused by this oil embargo, in the 1970s, Japan continued to grow at more than 4%, which was substantially higher than the UK and the US. This was the period when Japan began to establish global domination in several industries, from automobiles to consumer electronics and advanced machine tools. In the 1970s, Japanese automobiles became legendary. Toyota, Honda, Nissan mastered lean manufacturing and just-in-time production. Instead of stocking expensive inventory, parts arrived exactly when needed. This created unmatched efficiency and lower costs. At the same time, consumer electronic companies like Sony, Panasonic, Toshiba, and Canon began dominating global markets. Sony's Walkman became a cultural icon. Cameras of Nikon and Canon became the choice of professionals worldwide, and in just a few decades, Japan climbed from ruins to technology leadership. And this wasn't by fluke, it was a result of something. Japan invested heavily in human capital. Schools and universities prioritized STEM, precision engineering, and research. The workforce became highly skilled and exceptionally disciplined. At the same time, the government poured money into R&D, pushing companies to invent and not just imitate. And what was the result? It basically led to breakthroughs in semiconductors, optics, robotics, shipbuilding, and automobile manufacturing. Finally, we come to the 1980s, Japan's golden decade. The country became the world's second largest economy. Average incomes soared. Japanese banks grew so big that they started ranking amongst the biggest banks in the world. Real estate prices in Tokyo skyrocketed. At one point in time, land under Imperial Palace of Tokyo was valued more than all land in the entire state of California. Exports boomed. Japan overtook the US in industries it once couldn't even compete in. With rising wealth and global influence, many economists started predicting that Japan would soon become the richest country in the world, even surpassing the US. Without a doubt, this was the most dramatic economic comeback in human history. A nation that went from nuclear ashes to technological superpower in less than 30 years. But just when the world thought that nothing could go wrong and no cracks could emerge in Japan, that is exactly what happened. In 1985, the Plaza Accord was signed. Western nations, threatened by Japan's unstoppable export dominance, pressured Japan to let the yen appreciate sharply against the US dollar. If your currency basically rises, then everything in your country becomes more expensive in dollar terms, right? And that is exactly what happened with Japan. Overnight, Japanese products became more expensive globally. Exports slowed, factories began losing competitiveness, and corporate profits started shrinking. To counter the slowdown, Japan did what every nation does in panic. It cheapened credit. Interest rates fell, even below 0% at one point in time, and suddenly money flooded the system. Real estate and stock markets ballooned into one of the largest bubbles the world has ever seen. Tokyo's land prices became absurd. Art, golf memberships, antiques, everything was being speculated on. Companies borrowed more, spent more, and gambled more. And just when things were going great for Japan, the bubble popped. Between 1991 and 1993, the Nikkei stock index crashed by 60%. Real estate prices plummeted and trillions of dollars of wealth just vanished. Banks were left holding mountains of bad loans. Companies couldn't repay their debt. Consumers stopped spending, and Japan entered what economists now call the lost decade. Over 10 years of slow to no growth, deflation, stagnation, and corporate paralysis. But what's even worse is that long-term challenges grew even bigger. Japan's population began to shrink, birth rates dropped, and the workforce started aging rapidly. Fewer workers meant fewer taxpayers, fewer innovation, and fewer consumers. And we see the result of this even today. 30% of Japan's population is above 65, making it the most aged society on earth. With few workers and rising welfare costs, the economy struggled to grow. Productivity improvements couldn't keep up with demographic reality. The Nikkei, Japan's stock market index, shows this pretty well. It didn't grow at all in this period. And yet, despite all this, Japan never collapsed. It evolved. It doubled down on automation, robotics, advanced manufacturing, and precision technology. Industries where human quantity is replaced by technological quality. Japanese companies continue to dominate niches no one else can compete with them in. Japan's rise teaches the world three important lessons. Discipline can build nations, speculation can destroy them, and demographics can define them. Today, Japan may not be growing like the way it once did, but its legacy of efficiency, quality, innovation, and resilience continues to influence every factory, every supply chain, and every business school in the planet. From nuclear ruins to global leadership, Japan remains one of history's greatest economic turnaround stories. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. And as always, I hope to see you again soon.